Good morning, everybody. I am going to walk us through our notes for your box 8 questions. This is about Japan and their involvement in World War II. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to get yourselves organized. You'll need your unit notes, the ones that you've been typing in for China. Go ahead and get those open in a different tab and scroll on down to box 8. If you need to, you can pause and then just hit play again when you're ready to get going. So we're going to be focusing on Japan in World War II and what we did to help rebuild them after the war ended. You'll see that Japan needed a lot of help after the war ended, and we helped rebuild. So that's what we're going to be talking about. All right, so just to give you guys a little bit of background information, I want to share with you first some things about Japan before and leading up to World War II. So just like the British Empire, Japan was an empire in the early 1900s. And what it means to be an empire is that you control other parts of the world. And so Japan had forcefully invaded using their extremely strong military throughout the early 1900s. They had spread across Asia into areas like Taiwan, Korea, parts of China, and they were interested in invading and taking over even more places when World War II broke out. So they decided, for various reasons, that they were going to join the Axis powers in World War II, which was the American enemy. So they were siding with Germany and Italy in World War II. So your first question is, what was Japan's plan during World War II? Go ahead and pause here if you need to look back at the previous slide to find your answer and type it in. So the Japanese decided to attack the United States. Even though the U.S. was not yet in World War II, Japan decided to do a surprise attack on our Navy base located in Hawaii at a military station called Pearl Harbor. And this happened on December 7th of 1941. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, and many U.S. battleships and airplanes were destroyed. This was very damaging to the U.S. Here's just some pictures. So this is a ship called the USS Arizona. It just so happens that this ship was being used essentially as a storage facility for gunpowder and oil at the time of the attack. So it was, when it was hit, it just exploded essentially, and it sank. It broke in half and sank right down to the bottom of the ocean. And unfortunately, there were many Navy members on board who did not survive. Here's another picture of the Arizona exploding. So you can see that huge explosion even from a distance here, just showing the total devastation. Okay, so your next question is to explain the events of Pearl Harbor. So go ahead and pause if you need to. So after Pearl Harbor, the Americans felt that they could not sit back and let Japan get away with this attack. So the president, who was President Roosevelt at the time, went to Congress asking them to declare war on Japan. Congress agreed, and the United States officially entered World War II on December 8th, 1941. Now, because Japan's allies were Germany and Italy, once we declared war on Japan, Japan's friends declared war on us. So just a few days later, Germany and Italy had declared war on the United States. And within, just 3 days, the United States was deeply involved in World War II, and we were on the side of the Allies. Here is a picture of President Roosevelt signing the declaration of war against Japan. This is us officially entering World War II. And then this picture always kind of just gives me the chills a little bit, because this is a picture of Hitler declaring war on the United States. And you can see Hitler right here, kind of center right behind the symbol of Nazi power, with all of his advisors and political friends. And he's talking into a radio. So this is being broadcast across Germany, declaring war on the U.S. So I'll give you a second to hit pause to answer your question number 3. What was the U.S. response to the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor? So after Japan attacked, what did America do? All right. So you guys learned in 6th grade about our fighting in Europe during World War II, but in this class, we're focusing on Asia. And so the United States had to do something a little bit different because a lot of the Japanese controlled land was on islands out in the Pacific Ocean. And so the United States used a strategy called island hopping, and they essentially just like it sounds, they went from island to island to island, attacking the ones that were controlled by the Japanese. And their goal was to get closer and closer to the country of Japan. This was not easy. Some of you may have heard before of kamikaze pilots. These are Japanese soldiers who were willing to sacrifice themselves for their country. They would send their pilots into planes or into U.S. ships on purpose, knowing that they wouldn't survive, but attacking anyways. And that was very hard for us to compete with for a while because that's not how American soldiers, want to work. So here's a picture, for example, of an aircraft carrier hit by kamikaze plane. So some Japanese soldier, flew their plane into an aircraft carrier to damage it. All right. So in February of 1945, we got to the island of Iwo Jima. And this island is important because it was about as close to Japan as we could get. And it was a good place for our planes to land. It had flat land. You'll see some pictures in a minute, but there was flat enough land that our planes could land there. And it was very close to Japan itself. Unfortunately, though, the Japanese, knew we were coming because of our island hopping. And they had essentially booby-trapped the island and filled it with underground tunnels so they could move their soldiers across the island without us knowing. And it was an incredibly fierce and bloody battle. It took a very long time, but eventually the U.S., led by our Marine units, eventually were able to take over this island. So here's a few pictures, and you can see here, so we were essentially, and that thing's showing, but we were essentially taking over all of these islands one at a time. And then the last one that we took over was Iwo Jima. And you can see that in terms of getting close to Japan, this is also Japan, these little islands here. It's about as close as we could get. And I know it looks kind of far away, but this is a zoom in of a very small area. So it's actually not that far away. Here is soldiers fighting, and you can see how tough it would be because this is a mountain up in Iwo Jima, and the Japanese soldiers had strategically placed themselves here so they could fire straight at the American soldiers on the beaches of Iwo Jima. And so you can see here just what a challenging and scary situation it is. We did eventually take over. You can see in these pictures over here how flat parts of the island are, and that's what made it good for the planes to land. You can see the American boats at the like edge of the water. I'm blanking on what that word is. The shore, at the shore lined up, and an American flag being raised. And some of you probably have seen this photograph before. This is a very famous photo of the American soldiers who raised that flag. Okay, so your next question is about why it was important that we captured the island of Iwo Jima. So take a minute, go back in the video if you need to figure out why the U.S. capturing the island of Iwo Jima was significant. All right, so the next question after we got to Iwo Jima is what to do next. So we thought about invading Japan on land, but there was a concern that after the Battle of Iwo Jima being so bloody and so devastating that too many American soldiers would die, that it would be just absolutely devastating to the American military. So President Truman decided to use a new weapon that had just been developed in America that was called the nuclear weapon or an atomic bomb. And he decided to use that instead of invading on land in Japan. He did warn the Japanese government to surrender, but they refused to give up. Truman actually sent information over to Japan saying, basically, we have a new kind of weapon that you have never seen before, and it is going to devastate your country. Please surrender so we do not have to use it. But Japan's government refused. So on August 6, 1945, America dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in war on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. and Japan refused to surrender. Even with that, a few days later, the U.S. dropped a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki. Both cities were completely devastated. They were completely flattened, and Japan eventually had to surrender. They realized they could not fight against these atomic weapons. And all the way to today, 2021, Japan is the only country in the world that has been attacked by nuclear weapons, and America is the only country in the world that has used atomic weapons. So this is showing from the sky. This is the plane. This is a picture taken from the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. This is the mushroom cloud that erupted as the bomb was dropped. And then this is a picture of Hiroshima. So this was a city. You can see a few buildings remain standing, but there were buildings everywhere. There were homes, schools, hospitals, stores. And you can see now it's essentially completely flattened with maybe a couple trunks of trees or telephone poles popping up every once in a while. But, just about everybody that would have lived in Hiroshima was either severely hurt or killed. Here's just another picture of the mushroom cloud. This one is from Nagasaki. So this is right as it exploded. I don't know what the circumstances were that led to someone just happening to take a picture right here. I don't know if the photographer survived even, but this photograph did inside the camera that it was taken in. So your next two questions are 5 and 6. Why did President Harry Truman decide to drop the atomic bombs on Japan instead of invading on land? And what was the Japanese response to the atomic bombs? So after the two bombs were dropped, what did Japan do? All right, so once Japan surrenders, the two sides have to form a surrender paper. They did that on a U.S. battleship named the USS Missouri, which is actually still now a ship you can go visit. It's actually at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and you can take tours of it if you ever go to Hawaii. This day is known as VJ Day, meaning Victory in Japan Day, and it officially put an end to Japan's empire building and the war. If you remember, you learned last year about VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Here is a picture of the Emperor of Japan signing the surrender papers to a man named General Douglas MacArthur, who is going to be very important in the rest of our notes. This is some soldiers and some women very excited reading the newspapers saying Japan gives up, accepts Allied terms, war ends with world celebrating. So everybody was just so happy that World War II was finally over. Here's your next two questions. Questions 7 and 8. When did Japan surrender? And what is VJ Day? Okay, so now we need to look at what happened to Japan after the war, because we dropped these bombs. We'd completely devastated Japan physically and economically. They'd just lost a war. And so there was a lot of work to be done to bring Japan back to its former strength. So the country's infrastructure, which means things like transportation, communication, sewage and water lines, electric systems, were demolished. Industries and farms were destroyed, and the emperor was shown to be, just a guy who failed, which was pretty big to Japan. They had put a lot of faith into their emperor or their king that he would be able to lead them through World War II victorious. Again, here's just another example of the devastation that faced Japan after these atomic bombs. You can imagine what it was like to have to rebuild. And even in places where the atomic bombs were not used, we were dropping other types of bombs, just regular war bombs, across Japan as well. So even in parts of Japan that were not hit by the atomic bombs, this was the situation. Bombed out buildings, completely destroyed roads, infrastructure gone. And so they have to rebuild. Okay, so your next question is under Rebuilding Japan. It's question 1 under that section called, and it says, explain the destruction caused by the atomic bombs in Japan. So our plan was to occupy, which means to leave our military there and stay in control of Japan, because we wanted to rebuild them in a way that would guarantee they would never be a military threat to anyone else in the future. So that that guy I had told you we were going to be talking about, his name is General Douglas MacArthur, and he was put in charge of restoring and rebuilding Japan. So after the war, Douglas MacArthur stayed in Japan with his military from 1945 to 1952. Okay, so I'll give you a second to hit pause here to answer, what was the U.S. plan for Japan after World War II? So there were several things that MacArthur did right away. He closed Japan's military. He brought to trial all military leaders involved from Japan. And then he helped set up a new government in Japan. And it was a democratic government. We're going to talk a little bit more about the government in just a minute. But what the type of government he set up was a form of democracy. Here is Douglas MacArthur and Hirohito. They worked very close together throughout this time. Okay, so you've got your question, who was sent from the U.S. to implement this plan? And then, just as a hint, part of question 4 I just answered as well. So you can go back and listen to that to try to get part of that answer, because that's a 2-part question. All right, so besides being a democracy, MacArthur decided that Japan should be a constitutional monarchy so that they could keep the emperor in Japan. And the emperor is like the king. So it's a little bit like England, where there's the Queen of England, but then there's also a prime minister and a government that functions without the Queen's instructions. So Douglas MacArthur wrote Japan's constitution, which is called the MacArthur Constitution, and it's an extremely democratic document. The Japanese citizens have many of the same rights as American citizens. Okay, so the rest of your answer to number 4 is on that previous slide. What type of government did MacArthur help set up in Japan? Okay, so after World War II, there were 3 things that Japan had to do or not do. Japan was not allowed to declare war or fight with others unless they were attacked first. The Japanese government had to pay money to the countries that they had harmed during World War II. And the Japanese were also not allowed to rebuild their military in any way. This is a picture from Japan's constitution. I just wanted to show it to you so that you can see what writing in Japanese looks like. They write from the top of the page down instead of writing across the way we are used to. Okay, so question 5, what 3 things did Japan have to do after World War II? So we helped rebuild Japan. We spent a lot of money rebuilding Japan, and we did that really for 2 reasons. We were willing to help for 2 reasons. The United States knew that a friendly Japan would be valuable in the future. Remember, you just learned in the previous part of the unit about China turning communist, and you know that we don't like communists from last year in 6th grade. You probably learned about that with the Cold War. So we wanted to make sure that we still had a friend in Asia that was a democracy so we could trade with them. And then the other thing was we wanted to make sure that Japan stayed democratic instead of turning towards communism. Okay, so here's your spot to pause to answer question 6. Why was the U.S. willing to help Japan rebuild? And the last thing just to take a look at is their economy today. And our efforts to help rebuild they were successful. Japan has one of the most powerful economies in the world. They are one of the most stable democratic governments in the world, and they are one of our closest allies in Asia. Here's a picture of Tokyo, Japan now. If you picture those photos I showed you earlier of all the devastation in Japan, and then you compare it to this picture, I think that can give you a sense of how far Japan has come since World War II. And then here is your last question. Explain what Japan's economy is like today. So once you have typed in all of your notes, just make sure you've actually not missed any questions or anything like that. And then check with It's Learning that there's nothing you're behind in. And then you are done with this assignment for today.